I want to lead with this bombshell report per the New York Post on Tuesday. Quote, Sean Diddy Combs is a cuck who is secretly bi-curious but too ashamed to have sex with other men, Jane Doe said in bombshell testimony at his Manhattan trial on Tuesday. Um, Tom, first of all, I'm very curious as to your thoughts because you are off the heels of one of the highest profile criminal trials of the past 5 years, the Daniel Penny trial. And I don't even think in your trial you had a witness who took the stand for as many as 6 consecutive days. Is that right?
6 day witnesses, and there was no talk about my client's sex life either.
Oh, small mercies, right? Small mercies. I mean, what do you make of the prosecution having this Jane Doe on the stand for 6 days? Does some of this go to them really trying to, this is just my own supposition, dig into the nuances of how she could stay with him for 3 years while claiming she's also been victimized by him?
I think that's part of it. I mean, I think what they're trying to do is the prosecution. I mean, is the longer they keep her on the stand, the jury may develop more of a familiarity with her, more of an affection for her, understand, why it is that someone who claims to have been is sex trafficked by fraud, force, or coercion, or in a relationship that they didn't want to be in, forced to do, ungodly acts at the behest of Diddy, would have remained in that relationship, would have sent emails, communications of affection, and so forth. And this is a problem that you see in virtually every high-profile sex case. I mean, we saw this. I was watching a lot of the Harvey Weinstein trial this week in Manhattan, and same sort of issue. You explain how it is that you say that this person coerced you into a sexual relationship or forcibly raped you, but in the days and the weeks and even the years that followed in the case of some of those witnesses, you continue to be effusive towards them, continue to seek his affection, and so forth. Similar dynamic here in the Diddy case.
Tom, have you personally been going into that courtroom, the Harvey trial?
Yeah, absolutely, my friend. Well, first of all, I know the judge is presiding over the case. I've tried cases in front of Judge Curtis Farber in Manhattan, and I know Artie Idala is been a long-term friend of mine, great lawyer. We
Mm-hmm.
collaborate on a lot of things. In fact, Artie used the jury consulting team that we used in the Daniel Penny case on the Harvey Weinstein trial.
Fascinating. What
Yeah.
is your take on when you're looking at the jury in the Harvey trial? Do you have a sense at all of where they may be falling?
Well, with respect to the Harvey trial, I mean, that all culminated really within the last 24 hours. And, I did, when I first went into the courtroom and saw the trial, I thought that Harvey, had a good chance of getting something out of this. As it has turned out, he's got, a split verdict and a hung jury on the other count. But my read on the jury was that some of the members of that jury looked to be looking askance at some of the accusers, and maybe thinking that the accusers were maybe got had a little too much to gain from Harvey Weinstein at the time they got into the relationships with him, and that they seemed to be buying at least some of the transactional sex argument that the defense was putting forth in that case. And I think they were also looking a bit askance at how much they profited um, since they made these claims. Because remember, during the first trial of Harvey Weinstein back in 2018, 2019, that was returned on appeal, those witnesses were able to say, well, I'm not in it for the money, or I haven't gotten anything. Well, now no one anticipated that that case was going to be overturned. There would be a second trial. And now you come back 5, 6 years later, and it turns out they've all gotten large monetary settlements, and the jury gets to hear about that.
They
So
got
there are all
monetary
parallels here
settlements.
between, yeah, at least several of the witnesses had. Yeah, I mean, it was cross-examination of one witness who, at the time that she met Harvey Weinstein, she was an aspiring actress living in her car. Her career never panned out the way she had hoped it would. Um, And after she accused Harvey Weinstein, after his first trial, she got a settlement from some restitution fund of roughly $500,000. The jury got to hear about that.
Oh, wow.
Because
Oh,
remember,
wow.
a jury, a witness's bias, motivation, go to credibility, and that is virtually always fair game for the defense.
Tom, can you
So, it is
explain what
interesting
that,
the parallels here.
yeah, can you explain what that restitution fund is, where the money comes from, and who decides who gets how much?
Frankly, Maureen, I'm not privy to all the details from what I surmised. Yeah, it's a fascinating trial. I would have liked to sat through the whole thing. Unfortunately, I have a lot of other
Yeah.
trials that I'm tending to, and I couldn't be there as much as I want. But it sounded like there may have been money that came from Disney or Miramax, possibly from Harvey Weinstein himself. These restitution funds can come from a lot of different sources. We see them in federal court. And a lot of times in federal court, they're the product of an order of restitution that the court imposes either upon a plea of guilty or a conviction after trial. And the purpose of the restitution is to make the victims of the criminal offense whole.
I just find it so fascinating that these funds can be, they're so mysterious and we don't necessarily know where the money came from, whether it's a corporation, a person, taxpayers, and who decides the disbursement of said funds. I think that's fascinating. But to get back to Sean Combs, because these two cases are very much related. I mean, Harvey walked so Sean Combs could run. Jane some of her testimony this week was unbelievable. And of course, we have text messages and voice messages that either back up or contradict some of what each person is claiming. Now, after 5 days of testimony, so there are a couple of things. She was participating in these freak offs. Now, Jane, we know, is a social media either influencer or content creator. She is a single mother. She says that she was threatened by Sean Combs to continue to participate in these freak offs, or else he would release videotapes of said freak offs to her child's father. She had texted him at one point in September 2023. I don't want to feel obligated to perform these nights with you in fear of losing the roof over my head. Combs is still paying her $10,000 a month rent, which, again, as a defense lawyer, I mean, Tom, I would love to hear how you would thread that needle. Another text: I'm not a porn star. I'm not an animal. I need a break. How would you, if you were defending Sean Combs, try to explain away a text like that? I'm not an animal. I'm not a porn star. I need a break.
Well, I think what the defense is doing here, and it's a product of how the prosecution is trying this case, and it's very deliberate what they're doing. It's not uncommon for federal prosecutors to do this, particularly in the Southern District, is they try to marry really unseemly behaviors, morally contemptible behaviors. There's a line in the Weinstein trial, I hate to keep going back to that, is that there's a lot of real estate between immorality and illegality. Right. But the notion is that, if you paint him as such a horrible, abusive, psychologically abusive and opportunistic partner, spouse, boyfriend, lover, paramour, what have you, that inevitably bleeds over to the jury, and they're more likely to convict him regardless of whatever uncertainty they may have as to whether in fact he was actually a sex trafficker. If I'm the defense, you really have no choice. Sometimes you have to try to turn your weaknesses into advantages, or make lemonade out of lemons, as we sometimes say,
or baby oil.
I'm not touching that one. And you try to argue that, look, this guy, he's a bad guy. He may be an abusive partner. He may be this, he may be that, but this is not a referendum on what sort of soulmate my client is. This is a case about whether this is an individual that engages in sex trafficking by fraud, force, or coercion. Very, very serious charges and much different than what the government has produced here, however unsavory. And you try and flip the script and you say, look, ladies and gentlemen, think of it, think of how much you heard in this case, that really had to do with, what a bad guy my client is. Well, my client could be a bad guy and at the same time not guilty of the crimes that the federal government is accusing of him of in this case.
Tom, also, I only have a couple of minutes left with you, unfortunately. I could talk to you all day. So what came out in court either a couple of days ago or yesterday was Jane Doe has testified that there is an icon in the music industry, in the hip hop community, who was very close to Sean Combs personally and professionally for many years, and that this icon and his girlfriend were participating in some of these quote unquote sex parties. How is it that these names are not coming out in court? How is it that they are so anonymized and protected?
Well, that's usually the product of pretrial motions, usually on the at the behest of the government, where they seek to protect the names of victims. It's not clear if these individuals were victims or just participants.
Jane's saying he was a participant, not a victim.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, I mean, look, if he's a participant, I don't know what the logic is and why the court has any obligation to protect that individual's name. Now, if he's a witness or potential witness in the trial, the government may make a motion to keep him anonymous because you don't want to intimidate him from coming or her from coming forward.
Interesting.
That can be the basis. If the government makes a showing that look, they're at risk, that Diddy or his entourage have threatened witnesses in the past, that's an allegation that I know has been made during this case by the government.
Interesting.
In a lot of the pretrial litigation, that can be a basis for it. But again, the fact that somebody participates in sexual hijinks, call it a freak off or what have you, doesn't mean that they're guilty of a crime, doesn't mean that they were coerced, doesn't mean that they were forced. So the job for the defense here is to try to convince the jury that, they need to separate the unsavory conduct and look at whether or not the government has proven or for the defense's sake, hopefully failed to prove the actual criminal conduct.
Last question. Optically, Sean Combs' three of his sons have begun returning to the courtroom to attend this trial to support their father. Would you recommend that? And we're not talking like middle-aged sons. We're talking sons who look to be late teens, early 20s. Is that a good look for Sean Combs or no?
Generally, it's a good look. I mean, the idea is that, obviously a jury is not supposed to vote one way or the other based on sympathy for the defendant or sympathy for the prosecution or prosecution witnesses. But if you're the defense and you have an opportunity, of course, ethically and appropriately, trials are public trials. Anyone has the right to get in. Usually there's special seating reserved in a high profile trial for the family or very close friends of the defendant. You want to use every advantage you have. And if having his children in court can humanize the defendant in a trial that or prosecution that seems to be trying very hard to strip him of any sense of humanity in front of the jury. That's generally a good thing to do. I mean, that could be blowback if it's a very young child, someone who's of tender years. They're like, well, they don't belong being in a courtroom like this, hearing this sort of testimony. But if they're adult children, it's potential advantage.